Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Coralie Mills today to speak to us about the Southeast Scotland Oak Dendrochronology project, something that has been very close to her heart for many years. Coralie is a dendrochronologist and wooded landscape environmental archaeologist and has spent most of her working life in Scottish cultural heritage. She has an MA in environmental archaeology and Palaeoeconomy and a PhD in dendrochronology, both from Sheffield University. Coralie is also a director of the consultancy Dendrochronicle, providing services in dendrochronology, woodland heritage, and environmental archaeology. I first met Coralie at the Sheffield Hallam Investigating Tree Archaeology Conference in 2018, where she was speaking. I then reconnected with her in 2020 after being contacted by a colleague from the University of Pennsylvania Architectural Conservation Program, who was looking for a UK-based crack dendro expert to lecture to his students. And of course, I immediately thought of Coralie. Shortly after, I asked her to join us on the UK and international wood committees, and thankfully she did. Coralie has been concerned for some time that there is much less commissioned dendro work in Scotland than there is in England, and she has spent a good part of her career looking into why and developing approaches to tackle that. One such initiative is her Scottish Oak Dendro project, which she will be talking to us about today. Her very enticing title is Tree Ring Stories from a Historic War Zone. Coralie tells me that there are some exciting results to share on dates and provenances of timber in several medieval castles, churches, and archaeological sites, showing the impact of repeated warfare on the building stock and timber supply. Exciting. Okay, over to you, Coralie. Thanks.
Okay, so I do my share screen thing then.
Yeah.
And go to my slides and go share. Hopefully that will work. Can you see that?
Perfect.
Okay, marvelous. Okay, well, thank you so much, Doug, for that very generous introduction. It's been an absolute honour and privilege, and actually a really fantastic learning opportunity to be part of this group. And I do thank you all for turning up on what is probably a rather nice summer evening, and when you could be doing something far more exciting. So yeah, I'll get on with the story. The story from the war zone, the historic war zone that is Southeast Scotland. I'm talking about a research project here, but I will come back to that theme that Doug touched on there about the lesser degree of application of dendrochronology in Scotland. And my concern is not to fill my bank account, but because we are losing so many timbers without record from our historic buildings. So anyway, on with the story. So I'm going to talk about the Southeast Scotland Oak Dendrochronology project, which is a research project funded principally by Historic Environment Scotland through an archaeological research grant, and also with some generous funding from Forestry and Land Scotland. That is what the Forestry Commission are now called in Scotland, and they funded a related learning resource for school children about dendrochronology, and which has been published as part of this project. So sincere thanks to them. Huge thanks to Hamish, who has been out and sampled all these sites with me, and I'm so glad he happened along when he did. That's been a huge help to me, and also his insights about woodworking, timber working, because he's a practitioner, have been very valuable to me, and together we have sort of built a bigger story, I think. And so many other people have helped, and it really has been a huge team effort. So I'm going to start with, can I get rid of the thing at the top of the screen? Can I just click on it? No. Sorry. If I just press up here. Sorry. It's gone. Okay, I can't quite see my titles because I can't see the thing, move the thing at the top of the screen, but it doesn't matter. Okay,
we can see everything that I think you're presenting your full screen, Coralie.
Good. It's just that I can't, but I can remember, I think. Okay, so why choose to look at the southeast of Scotland? Well, if you have a look at the map, you can see there's actually quite a big gap down here. We've got a lot of sites along the Forth coast around Edinburgh and into East Lothian and up to Stirling and Fife coasts, but there's hardly anything in here. Got a few more sites in the southwest, and that's because Mike Bailey did some work in the southwest back in the 1970s and built the first long oak chronology for Scotland. But we got this big gap in the southeast, and I should explain what the colour coding on that map means. Was some background noise coming from somewhere? Yeah, I should explain what the codes mean on the map. The squares are oak sites and the triangles are pine sites. The red symbols are imported timber and the blue symbols are native timber. So we've got, actually, all we've got in southeast Scotland, apart from the coastal sites, is one timber from under a foundation raft under Jedburgh Abbey. The other blue square is actually a living woodland. And you can see how much imported timber there is along this coastal area. And a huge gap in here. The bar diagram is showing you a sort of accumulated record of what the tree ring record from Scotland is telling us, really. And so the scale at the bottom is time. It's the last 1,000 years. And earlier on, we have all these white bars. Each bar is a building or a site. And it's all the data from one site put together. And it's showing you that we have lots of native timber with long tree ring records that span several centuries up until the middle of the 15th century. And then there's a big change in the colour coding. And that is the point at which we predominantly see imported timber in the record. I just happened to be commissioned to work on this particular building in Jedburgh, which is in the Scottish borders. This was back in about 2012. It was built with oak, which was a surprise in itself. And it was an enormously difficult challenge to date it. One, it was quite young oak, but secondly, there was no reference data anywhere nearby with which to compare it. Eventually, I was able to date it with help from Kathy Tyers, who provided me with copies of English data from the very, very far northeast of England. And I was eventually able to date it against that. And it was actually more similar to that than it was to anything from that period in Scotland. But it shows that there's quite a lot of geographical diversity in Scotland and that the southwest is very different climatically to the southeast. Anyway, it highlighted to me the need to build up the native oak record for southeast Scotland, because probably our native timber sites are underrepresented in the tree ring record. We do have sites which are undated, and that is because we haven't yet built up enough native Scottish tree ring reference data. And so this was one of the sort of stimuli for getting started on building up the native oak record for southeast Scotland. So where are we doing this? Well, we're doing this in Edinburgh, the Lothians and the Scottish borders. So this Edinburgh up here, East Lothian over here, Mid Lothian here, and then down into the borders here. And where I started was to build as long as possible living oak chronology, and I used this amazing site which is called the Dalkeith Old Oaks, which is just outside of Edinburgh, in Midlothian. It's an old park around Dalkeith Palace, and it has oak trees which actually have, some of which have records back into the 16th century. So by taking samples from fallen dead oaks at Dalkeith, I was able to build an oak record back to the middle of the 16th century. However, only a handful of the trees were really that old. Many more of them dated to around about 1700, when there was a planting episode in the wood. So the replication is a bit thin before about 1700. So when it came to designing the South East Scotland project, I wanted to look for sites that would have could give a tree ring record from sort of 1700 and back. And what I did was a lot of desk work first. I went through lots of records about buildings and a few archaeological sites in this region to identify a short list to go and visit to assess. So I looked at about 112 sites on a desk-based assessment. I visited about 28, well, ultimately about 30 of them. Most of them weeded themselves out by having no historic timber or no oak. Many of the ones that did have historic timber had pine or conifers. And so this shortlist selected itself. Out of those sites that I looked at, these were the 8 sites that had potentially useful oak timbers in them, which just shows how rare surviving oak structures are in South East Scotland. That is roughly how I guessed they might pan out time-wise. Although that was all guesswork at that stage, nobody really knew what period the timber work in these buildings would hail from. I'm going to sort of go round the different counties one by one. So I'm going to start in Edinburgh and with the later end of things. Now, there was a written record, that timber from Dalkeith had been used in Heriot's School, which was built in the 17th century. So I went to assess Heriot's and discovered that virtually everything in it was pine. However, what is now the clock tower and was originally a bell tower does have oak in it, presumably in order to give more strength to the structure that's holding up some really, really heavy bells and machinery. And we took samples from there. It turned out that they were original. They dated to 1670, which is actually quite late on in the long history of Heriot's being built. And very surprisingly, they came from southern Norway. And the reason that's surprising is that Norway actually cut off oak exports in 1602 because she was running out of oak. She'd already exported so much of her oak. And but it does look as though occasionally oak was getting out of Norway for specialist purposes. The next site is Abbey Strand, which is in Holyrood, next to the Parliament, next to the Palace. And this is a sort of accommodation block, which was originally the Abbey Guest House, but has evolved over time. And it's a really complicated building. It was being refurbished, and Kirkdale Archaeology were doing the building recording. And there was an opportunity to get in there and get some samples because some of the timbers were actually being removed and replaced. So we took slice samples of them. It was a real diverse bunch. There was very little coherence in the assemblage. There were sort of ones and twos of timbers, sort of dating or matching each other. But I think the most unusual thing about this building is the reuse of timber. I mean, that's not unusual in Scotland, but what they were reusing is quite unusual. Never seen this before. These are sled runners, and they are built with 16th century Scandinavian oak, and they've been reused as joists in flooring, probably in the 17th century. And, one could invent all sorts of interesting stories about whether they were sleds in Norway or in Scandinavia being flogged off to the desperate Scots who would buy any stick of timber they could get their hands on, or whether they'd actually been imported as sleds, because we are talking about the Little Ice Age here, and the situation of Holyrood is actually, would have been at that time almost like an island with a little causeway across to it. So you can imagine in a hard winter, there were a lot of icy surfaces around there. So maybe it was even something that was being used locally. There were quite a lot of younger oak sequences that did not date, and it's possible that amongst those is some native Scottish oak. But we need a certain length of tree ring sequence, as well as replication of the signal with multiple samples, ideally, to be able to date stuff. So individual short sequences are very, very difficult to date. But this is probably the star of the show as far as Edinburgh goes. I'm sure many of us have walked past St Giles Cathedral on the Royal Mile on the High Street many a time, not realising that there is a 5-storey timber bell frame inside the tower under the famous crown spire. It's absolutely exquisite woodworking and structure. It's just an amazing structure. I've never seen anything else like it in Scotland. And it turned out to be 15th century. Even more excitingly, it turned out to be native oak, but not from anywhere near Edinburgh. The material it matches very closely with is from northeast Scotland, and it gives a very, very close match with the Great Hall roof at Darnaway Castle in Morayshire. And the Royal Forest of Darnaway is very well known for having supplied many important building projects all over Scotland. It's recorded in the, Crown records that, it was used for many other places. And in fact, there's some has turned up at Stirling Castle that also matches very closely with Darnaway Castle. So it is likely, although not proven, that it comes from Darnaway Forest. And it makes a lot of sense historically. I won't go into the historical context, but it all makes a lot of sense. And it would have been timber being supplied to this very high prestige church in Edinburgh when James II was on the throne, and then continued under his widowed queen, Mary of Gelders, who was a patron of other buildings, including Trinity Kirk in Edinburgh. So it's a really quite an exciting and unexpected story. And I think there's so much more we could do here. We only took a smallish number of samples. Really, it would be really incredible to go back and record all the woodworking, all the marks. I mean, there are lots of marks, including, as you can see here, these taper marks. There are protection marks. Well, I see them as protection marks in many places on this huge timber frame. So there's an awful lot more we could do here, but it just shows the hidden potential of buildings that we've all been walking past for a very long time. There's a few more details of the structure, and just, some of the things that Hamish noticed that I probably never would have done. For example, in the base layer, the level 1 of this structure, these corner beams, in one corner they have had a strut. Well, I think all the corners have had a strut added, and if you look round behind it, you can see the impressions of a mallet or a hammer that are used to wedge it into place. And that has a slightly later date. It's about 50 years later. So this is Scandinavian oak, which was felled in 1508. So they must have been doing some work to kind of strengthen and shore up the original structure then in the early 16th century. Oh, and it was pretty exciting too. This came very late on in the project, but one of the staff at Historic Environment Scotland had done a project at this Norman church, which is heavily modified in the post-medieval period. And she had noticed some interesting looking timbers on the stairwell up to the bell tower. That's them here, just 2 of them. But when I looked at the photographs, I thought, yeah, they do look potentially early. And right enough, they have turned out to be native Scottish oak. felled in 1203, so providing the first scientific date for the Romanesque phase of this church. And their best matches with Caerlaverock, but really at this stage, this doesn't mean very much because we haven't got anything between Edinburgh and Caerlaverock, which is down here in the southwest, to compare it with. So it could be from pretty close by, probably, but it's hard to say at this stage. Moving on to East Lothian, this is St Mary's in Haddington, which, well, people had told me years ago not to bother with it because it'd all been so heavily restored, or so much of it had been lost in history, that there wouldn't be anything of interest. Well, the exact reverse is true. The nave roof is a complex structure built with reused timber that's probably been reused 2 or 3 times, but probably all hails from the church, and much of it is probably oak recycled from the original construction of St Mary's, and no one really knows the date of that construction. There's no specific documentary record of when it was built. We just kind of know it was somewhere between the late 14th and the middle 15th century. But I've got a date from oak rafters which have been reused, but the size of them means that they must have come out of the church roof, surely. They date to the first decade of the 15th century, to the early 1400s. They've been flipped. You can kind of see this here, probably been flipped anyway. They've all got nail marks on the inner face, and we're thinking that they were probably originally carrying the sarking in the original construction. The form of the roof now looks to me to be, well, possibly 18th century even, but I think there was a big repair phase in the 16th century after the rough wooing, the siege of Haddington, when the nave, after the Reformation, or at the Reformation, the nave was repaired to become the parish church in which John Knox preached. So we know that it was repaired at that stage, but it's probably been modified again later on. But here we have a date, and then we have a remarkable provenance as well. Now, some of you will have heard of timber coming into Britain from the Eastern Baltic, but it usually arrives as boards, as Estland boards or Eastland boards, which are fine boards of oak, which are generally used for carving or for painting. So here we have structural timber from the Gdansk, Danzig region, being used in a church in Scotland in the early 14th century. And I found it interesting when reading around this to discover that there was actually a Scottish trading settlement in Danzig from at least the late 14th century. So it may be that we've got Scots on either side of the seaways arranging this sort of export-import trade for important buildings. Moving into the Scottish borders, a couple of quick examples of other imports. So you know that I'm looking for native oak, but of course you're bound to find more imports while you're looking. Fast Castle was excavated back in the 1970s, and some of the timber had been preserved in a deep pit in the site and is in the collections of the National Museum of Scotland. So I was allowed to look at that stuff, but it soon became apparent that too is imported Scandinavian stuff. And there was an excavation near a castle, Buncle Castle. The castle's long gone, but there was a moat around it, and some woodwork survived in the moat. It was nearly all non-oak, but there was one oak post that turned out to be felled in the early 17th century, probably, and to come from Germany. So yet more imports, not quite what I was looking for. One of my favourite sites, because I got married there. I didn't know, though, when I got married there in 2003, that I was standing on the very thing I was looking for all these years later. So this is Needpath Castle very, very far up the River Tweed. It's 100 kilometres away from the coast. It's got a lot of wonderful historic woodwork, timberwork surviving in it. It has an oak roof and it has oak joists in a basement level. And the roof turned out to be, well, mid 16th century is exactly right for this sort of roof. But look, it comes from Norway, all the way up the River Tweed in the 16th century. But in the basement, in the floor I was standing on when I got married, these massive oak joists are holding that floor up. Turns out that they are original. They're a very early stage of construction of this complex castle site, which has evolved over time. They were felled in the winters of 1412 to 13 and 1414 to 15. And they are native oak. From looking at the statistics, I think they have to be pretty local, and looking at the location as well. And Needpath sits within what was the Ettrick Forest, one of the medieval hunting forests of Scotland. So that was all pretty exciting and gave us some new native oak data. There's a bit more detail. Karen will like these. I think I've sent these photos to Karen before. Up in one of the rooms in the upper level, we've got a lost attic floor, and then we've got joists under it, which are reused painted beams. They turn out too to be Scandinavian, Norwegian material, but they've got a mix of designs on them. So we don't think they're in their primary position. We think they've come from somewhere else, either at Needpath or another building. And these original early 15th century beams that I'm talking about are here in that floor there. But when the castle was very first built, that would have been an open vault like that. So what we're looking at is a castle built probably in the late 14th century, and then this vault subdivided a couple of decades later. Another beautiful castle country house is at Traquair, which is, so here we are on the map. That was Needpath, all the way up here near Peebles. Traquair is also a long way up the River Tweed. It's the oldest continuously inhabited castle in Scotland. It does have some oak in its roof. Oops, sorry. It has some oak in its roof, but it clearly has been sort of restructured at some point. You've got a mix of pine and oak amongst the historic material, and then you've got a very modern repair as well. It's incredibly young material. I couldn't date it. I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say I've got a date for this, but it's interesting to see that the closest match is with Danish material at 1544. And given the results at Needpath, which are definitely right, that is possible. It's just possible that we've got more imported Scandinavian oak coming all the way up the Tweed to Traquair in the middle of the 16th century. What has happened at this building is that they raised the whole roof level in the 17th century. So they lifted the roof off, put it back on again, but added in some new bits and pieces or repaired some bits and pieces when they did that. So that's why it's a bit of a hodgepodge. Very exciting site, an archaeological one this time. We're on the River Teviot, which is a tributary of the Tweed, and a local community heritage group discovered the remains of a medieval bridge under this 18th century toll bridge, which is not used anymore either. There's a modern bridge that carries the A68 just next door. So we've got multiple crossings on the more or less the same line. And it's built with fairly young, has to be native oak. So far, it's eluded absolute dendro dating. So we've relied on radiocarbon wiggle matching so far, which has worked pretty well. It's given us a felling date within a 20-year range between 1340 and 1360. Obviously, if we could dendro date it, we'd get a felling date to a year. And that would be helpful because the historical context in the borders in the middle of the 14th century is pretty complicated. That's just showing you how the ring patterns match. We've got 4 matching timbers, and be building up a reasonable record from this site, but not quite enough yet in the absence of other local reference data to be able to absolutely date it. This is the radiocarbon stuff. Probably don't need to go into this, but this is how we arrived at a fairly precise radiocarbon date for the felling of those oaks. Bit of a busy slide, sorry about that, but basically I'm talking about a site which is down here, Ancram Old Bridge, near Jedburgh, between Jedburgh and Melrose. Well, actually, right beside this old bridge, there's the archaeological remains of a bishop's palace. The see of the bishops of Glasgow stretched all the way over to here, absolutely vast territory. It's quite a strategic place, and there are many reasons for all sorts of people to build a bridge here. Could be ecclesiastical, it could be English, it could be Scottish, it could be the crown, it could be the bishops, it could be the local Douglas clan who tried to hold this territory. It could be the Percys from the English side who sometimes held this territory. So it's very, very complex. If we could pin the date down to a year, we would have a much better chance of working out who built it. Unfortunately, our colleague Neil Loader, who's here tonight, is going to try dendroisotope dating, which can work better for short ring sequences. But I know Neil will want me to give the caveat that at the moment we have relatively little reference data from the northern half of Britain. So, it's a bit of an experiment, but it is certainly worth a try. The other thing that would be worth a try is, if ever more timbers are revealed, is taking more samples and expanding the true ring record. So when we stand back and look at all the sites that have been worked on in southeast Scotland for this project, and including any other native oak sites, and this is what we get. And I'd like you to compare that with this diagram over here. That's what Mike Bailey achieved out of 6 sites in southwest Scotland. He got a continuous 1,000-year record from 6 sites. It's just totally different in southeast Scotland. We have itty-bitty, short little bits of data with big gaps, sort of 13th century, 15th, 16th century. We've got a lot of gaps in our native oak records still. And it is because of impacts on the environment, basically, which I'll come back to. We have got the difficulties with the timber supply being met by bringing timber from different parts of Scotland that still had more timber. We've got timber that's coming from the Eastern Baltic, very unusually. And one of the Nepath timbers actually looks Baltic too. We've got this whole heap of Scandinavian stuff. And we see this so often in our 16th century buildings. Scandinavian oak is very common. And we had that odd little timber from Germany as well at Buncle. So, we've got gaps, and they're being met by international trade largely. You may notice that none of that trade is with England. And we have virtually mutually exclusive timber records because Scotland and England did not trade with each other until very late on the whole. It's a bit of a generalisation, but on the whole. So why do we have this sort of interrupted record? Well, what a principal reason is the number of wars that were fought, the repeated warfare across this part of Scotland. It just kept on happening. And even when there weren't wars, there was disruption. There were raiding parties going across the borders each way. So, it's very hard to have the long-term strategic thinking and the resources that you need for forestry when you don't even know whether you'll still have a house next week, So we've got a really unsettled region. I think that is one of the principal difficulties. Though the wars, I should say, impacted people, of course. People just upped and left quite often. And it impacted land and land ownership, land management. We lost so many buildings. That's another thing. We lost lots of buildings. We had cycles of construction, destruction, and rebuilding, and new timber demands often being met by imported timber. We lost a lot of our built heritage, therefore. We certainly lost a lot of our vernacular buildings in this region. I mean, there really are very few early vernacular buildings in southeast Scotland. And the improvement era and the lowland clearances, they started early in the lowlands. And so there's a long time for them to have an impact. But the other big thing we've got to think about is grazing pressure. David I established a number of large abbeys in southeast Scotland, like Jedburgh, like Melrose. Well, the abbeys created extensive sheep farms. And, you know, we all know really that in grazing impacts are the enemy of woodland regeneration. And this is a big factor as well in southeast Scotland. So the timber record in southeast Scotland, what have we achieved? Really, well, we have extended the native oak record. We've got several new sites, but it's been pretty difficult. We've not found any old growth medieval native oak timber, well, apart from my old Dalkeith oaks that are still there. Unlike southwest Scotland, where there was lots of, 300-year oak in the sites that Mike Bailey looked at. We first see the timber supply issues around the coast in Edinburgh and East Lothian, and they are bringing timber from either northeast Scotland or even from the eastern Baltic in around about 1400 into the 15th century. And then by the middle of the 16th century, even 100 kilometres up the River Tweed, folk are relying on Scandinavian imported timber. One of the things I'd really love to look into further is a sort of cross-border project to look at Berwick-upon-Tweed and its role, because it was an absolutely major medieval port and it had sort of special kind of protected status and was often fought over between Scotland and England as well, and has been Scottish as well as English. And, its history would be very relevant to tracking the history of the timber trade in southeast Scotland. I think we've demonstrated the value of studying historic timbers in Scotland, in southeast Scotland. We can get precision dating when we do look at them. We can get really interesting provenancing information. We found intact 15th century structures that nobody knew was there. We've got early dates for Kirkliston, for Ankmel Bridge, for St Mary's. These, when you have precise dates, then you have a springboard for documentary research because you know exactly what period to look for evidence. I think one of the other things that's come out of it is they have got these phases of woodland recovery as well. We've got a phase of planting in the 16th century, and that is because the Scottish Parliament at the time, well, the King and the Scottish Parliament passed legislation because they were realising that they were in a dire state with respect to timber supply, and they required landowners to plant trees. And actually, many of them did. So we see that in medieval parks like Cadzow and Dalkeith. But also, if you remember that site I showed you very near the beginning at Jedburgh, the townhouse, well, those oaks in the 17th century townhouse in Jedburgh, they started life just after the Reformation. And there were big changes in land ownership at the Reformation. It's a big land grab by the aristocracy to take over the abbey and church lands. And I think some of them used that opportunity to plant trees and to meet the old supply and demand story, and perhaps make some cash out of their new assets. Oh, I mentioned a learning resource, which Forestry and Land Scotland funded, and this is available from their website, and it's suited to sort of late primary, early secondary age kids and grown-up kids like us as well. So do have a look at that. I was going to say this will be a story for another day, Doug, but the sort of parallel story is about pine, of course, in Scotland. We have heaps of pine in our buildings. We probably have far more pine than we have oak. You know, we all started out looking at oak because that's what dendrochronologists in Britain did. But actually in Scotland, we needed to look at pine, and we have looked at pine. So there's sort of two aspects to this. There's our native pine timber record. And from the map, from the blue triangles, you can see a big cluster of them up in the sort of the north, in the Highlands, in the Cairngorms and beyond. That was work done through the SCOT-UK NERC funded project at University of St Andrews with Rob Wilson. Principally a dendroclimate project, but NERC asked us to look at buildings too. And so I got hired to look at buildings and dated 20 buildings which have native pine structures, basically. And they range from, there's 15th century examples, actually, 15th century to the 19th century. So if you look, you shall find, just nobody had looked before. And these sorts of buildings are being lost all the time. Look at that little cottage. Look at this. That is C-listed. It's on an estate. It is falling apart. Nobody does anything about it. And it will fall. It will just be lost. And it's not the only one. There are many, many, many. And it seems like somehow this falls between the stools of every heritage authority that there is. More often, we get asked to do work. The commissioned work tends to sort of be in the Central Belt mainly, and quite a lot of 17th century buildings in the Central Belt. And many of them are built with Scandinavian pine, principally from Norway. And here's a recent example that I've worked on, which is Proven Hall, which is actually in Easterhouse, of all places, near Glasgow. It's the most westerly example we have. It's nearer the west coast than the east coast. The most westerly example of using Norwegian pine in the 17th century, well, at any time, actually. So you'll also notice from our map that we have very few sites on the west, except for the ones that Mike Bailey did way back in the 70s with research money. We have, in the 18th century, have examples of Eastern Baltic pine, for example, at Fort George, coming from multiple different ports and areas, from Karelia on the Karelia on the Finland-Russian border to Riga and Memel. And that's what we thought. We thought until recently there was a switch probably away from Scandinavian stuff into Eastern Baltic pine in the middle of the 18th century. But the most recent project that Hamish and I have done for Historic Environment Scotland is this: Stirling Castle. Two of the later buildings at Stirling Castle, much overlooked, garrison era buildings when the British Army was based at Stirling Castle. Well, the guardhouse is slightly earlier. It has a common rafter roof, which is a very Scottish style of roof. The Fort Major's house is a little bit later. It has a trussed roof with purlins and these massive king post frames. Both roofs have a plethora of marks scribed onto them. And of course, because the literature that we can find about timber shipping marks is about the Eastern Baltic, we first assumed that these would be Eastern Baltic, but they are not. They are all from southeast Norway. And so the marks that Hamish has painstakingly recorded are perhaps the first study of Norwegian shipping marks on pine in Britain, as far as we know, and perhaps anywhere, because we just can't find any other information about it at the moment. There may be some in Norwegian, but we have spoken to Van Dennebill, who is the guy that wrote a paper about timber shipping marks, and he says he has not seen these before. So there's one to come back to another time. There's an awful lot more we could say about that, but I won't. I'll make this final point before I come to the conclusions, that just as Doug said at the beginning, in England, we've got over 4,000. This was like a couple of years ago, we're probably approaching 5,000 dendro-dated buildings in England. And it's principally Historic England who commission this work, although there are other I'm sure there are many other commissioners too, but they do commission a lot of work to inform their listing process. In Scotland, this just kind of doesn't happen. And most of the work that's been done has been done through research grants. A smaller number of sites have been dated through commissions, but we only have a couple of council authorities where conditions are put on buildings, where timbers are being impacted by development. And we're losing so much. That's really the point. There's so much that could be done in Scotland. It isn't that the timber isn't there. The timber is there. South East Scotland's probably the worst example in a way, because we've lost so much there. But much of the rest of the country has got so much surviving early historic timber, which really would be worth studying. There's so much we don't know. We need to build up our native reference data. We need to look at the timber supply patterns in different parts of the country, and we need to tie this all up with doing woodworking and timber studies and form studies. So there's so much more we could do. So you'll be relieved to know I've come to my final slide. Just a few points about the South East Scotland Oak Dendro project. I must say it was only a sample. I didn't look at every building in South East Scotland. There'll be many more exciting things yet to discover down in this region. But it did show, it just did give the character of what survives, really. We now know that the native oak tree ring record is sparse in South East Scotland, and really any oak from anywhere is pretty rare. So really every surviving historic oak site is an important site. There isn't any long-lived medieval native oak timber that grew in South East Scotland. Anything long-lived has come from somewhere else, certainly over the last 1,000 years anyway. We see that this reflects the impacts of war, instability and grazing pressure on this regional tree ring record. We see that reliance on imports from the 15th century along the coastal belt, and then from the 16th century further inland, far inland. We never get asked to do commissioned work on churches. That just does not come up through the system at all. But by accident almost, the study of 3 Scottish pre-Reformation churches in this study, it just shows what else could be out there, how exciting that could be. And also the Ancramole Bridge site shows the potential for waterlogged site survival. And when the things above ground were being burnt, some things below ground would have survived. So this is all being brought together for a publication very soon. And the key message I want to leave you with is that our Scottish historic timber work needs far greater respect and resources, because it has many more exciting stories to tell. Thank you.